The history of the city of Constantinople is, similarly to the history of the city of Rome, often wrongly portrayed in many videos, books, movies, and in media in general. The same oversimplifications are made as in the case of Rome. In the case of Rome, it is often wrongly said that the city fell in 476 AD, when we by now have learned that Rome actually went on in 476 AD as if nothing happened, and the real disaster came 60 years later with the Gothic Wars. These same oversimplifications are also made with Constantinople, the new Rome. In the case of Constantinople, it is often said that when it fell in 1453, that this was the end of a magnificent and beautiful city which was very populated and had many magnificent buildings. But, as we shall see in this video, the real disaster for Constantinople actually happened in 1204 AD, when the city was sacked by the Fourth Crusade, and in reality, by 1453, Constantinople had become more cow pasture than city. But what would an eyewitness have seen before, during and after the sack of Constantinople in the year 1204 AD? By now we have on this channel explored in multiple videos the urban and architectural history of the city of Rome. You can find all the videos that deal with this topic in this playlist here. And of course we have done the same with the new Rome, the city of Constantine, built on and extending the older city of Byzantium and the even older Greek Byzantion. We have found to our great surprise that exactly as Rome, Constantinople had witnessed huge catastrophes and that the population had declined from around 500,000 before the outbreak of the plague, so around 530 AD, to only around 50,000 people around the year 700. I analyzed the pretty bad state of the city in these so-called Byzantine Dark Ages in this video here. Most of the old temples and monuments and baths had started to fall into ruin. The many fountains and nymphia of the city were dried up, and the aqueducts that were cut in 626 by the Avars had still not been repaired. It was a truly dark time, and most of the city was a ghost town during those days. But as the empire began to recover, we have found in this video here, so did the city recover again. And by the year 1000, Constantinople was again a magnificent city with hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. Estimates of the population for Constantinople are notoriously difficult, even more difficult than those for Rome, but many scholars such as Cyril Mango state that the city might have again reached the population as in the early reign of Justinian, so around 500,000 people. However, as I have also detailed, we should not make the mistake to believe that the Constantinople from Basil II's days up to the sack of 1204 looked like the old Constantinople of the days of Justinian or Theodosius or even Constantine. This was, even though also very large and impressive, a quite different Constantinople. The old fora of Theodosius, of Arcadius, of Leo, they had started to fall into ruin long ago, around 1200. Most of them were already in a very ruinous state. In fact, most of the old imperial buildings from the early days of Constantine to Justinian were not even standing anymore. This medieval Constantinople had been in many parts built upon the old Constantinople. Exactly as in Rome before, the people had just built their dwellings onto the old city. Stones from the old imperial monuments were reused as building material for new houses, for new churches, for new monasteries, for new palaces. The city had devoured itself, and a new Constantinople had been born, a medieval Constantinople, where if you would have had a time machine and you could travel to the year 1200, you would be surprised to find that not much of the old imperial Roman times was left. Yet, at the same time, some other parts of the city did indeed still carry some semblance of the old imperial times. The Hagia Sophia, built in the days of Justinian, was still standing as magnificent as ever. The aqueducts were working again. They had been repaired already in the latter half of the 8th century, but later again first by Basil II in 1021 and then by Romanus III in 1034. The imperial palace was until the late 11th century still the same palace in which Constantine himself had lived after making Constantinople the capital of the Roman Empire. It was only around 1100 that Alexius I Komnenos had moved the imperial residence to the Blachernai Palace. In the Oval Forum, the old Forum of Constantine, the column of Constantine was still standing, even in the year 1200. His statue had been toppled by lightning in 1150 and was replaced by a cross though. The Forum itself must have appeared old and weathered, yet even so, the old Senate House was still standing, although it was not used as a Senate House anymore, more as a storage room. But the overall shape of the Forum was still intact. However, there was a cattle market there now, and it must have appeared weathered and damaged in parts. But then again, there were impressive old antique statues mounted in the Oval Forum. Some even say that the statue of Athena Parthenos, the old statue of Athena, which had once stood in the Parthenon, had been carried to Constantinople and stood 11.5 meters tall in the Oval Forum. But the statue of Athena in the Oval Forum could have also been the statue of Athena Promachos, also a great work by Phidias himself, which stood not in the Parthenon but on the Acropolis of Athens for about 1000 years. According to some accounts, it was carried off to Constantinople around the year 465, and it might have been this statue which was then destroyed in 1203 or 1204. Or maybe both statues of Athena were actually standing in the Oval Forum of Constantinople, but unfortunately we cannot know this for sure. However, it is quite likely that the Forum was filled with many other antique statues from Constantinople's long Roman and Greek history. And if you are a Rome nerd like me, and chances are pretty high that you are if you are watching this video, then you might be interested in the incredible rings and other Roman accessories which the SPQR Shop is building. They make legionary rings, they make rings with different themes, they even make coin replicas, statues, pendants, attributes and terracottas. And the most incredible thing is that they handcraft every single piece. That's right, this is really high quality handcrafted material. There's really no better present for yourself or someone you know who might be a Rome fan. I put the link to their shop in the video description and into the pinned comment, and with this link you can get a 10% rebate on every purchase if you type in the rebate code Maiorianus. So go and check out their assortment, it's really quite incredible. Now back to Constantinople. Apart from the Forum of Constantine, the old Theodosian land walls were also still standing, and the city still had most of the old ports from the times of Julian or Theodosius. So from around the year 800, when the revival of Constantinople had begun, up all the way to 1203 AD, the city had enjoyed an incredible revival, where like a phoenix from the ashes, Constantinople had risen again from desolation and depopulation in the Eastern Roman Dark Ages, until once again it would be the largest and most impressive city in Europe by far. And we are astounded to find some of the old Roman imperial monuments, such as the Oval Forum, the Hagia Sophia, the Imperial Palace, and even the Hippodrome itself still intact. Yes, old and weathered, but intact, and many old statues still preserved in parts. Thus, the city even then retained some of its old classical heritage. But then multiple tragedies struck, from which Roman Constantinople would never again recover. The real disaster for Constantinople is not, as too often wrongly portrayed, the so-called fall of the city in 1453. As we shall see in future videos, Constantinople was by that time a depopulated agglomeration of villages, more cow pasture and fields than city, interspersed by ruins everywhere and having only 50,000 inhabitants. By 1453, Constantinople was really only a shadow of its former self and could not even be called a city anymore, more a collection of villages, very different from how the city is portrayed in some movies. And the reasons why Constantinople had fallen again to such lows were the tragedies that struck shortly after the year 1200. In 1200, the city still had 500,000 inhabitants and appeared still as magnificent as it did around the year 1000 during the reign of Basil II. We shall examine the Crusades and how exactly it could have come to this disastrous sack of the city in 1204 in future videos. When the Crusaders arrived at the city in 1203, they were astonished, for never before had they seen such a populous and magnificent city filled with so many palaces and churches. According to one account, the city in 1203 boasted 64 monasteries and 294 churches and countless palaces and golden cupolas glittering in the sun. But it was then in 1203 that the Crusaders began with the siege of the city. In that same year, in August, a fire broke out as a direct consequence of the siege, which was quite devastating. Many buildings burned down, making tens of thousands of people homeless and quite likely destroying many statues and other antiquities from the Imperial Roman times. But this was just a taste of things to come. In April of the year 1204 then, the Crusaders managed to storm the city. As I said, I will make a much more detailed video about the exact events, but suffice it to say that it was disastrous for Constantinople and its inhabitants. It is not exactly known how many people had been killed during the sack, but the numbers certainly go into the thousands. But the Crusaders also looted, pillaged and vandalized Constantinople for 3 days, during which many of the previously mentioned antique statues and other works of art were either stolen or destroyed. If the statue of Athena Parthenos was really still standing in the Oval Forum in 1204, we can be pretty sure that afterwards it was not anymore. A large bronze statue of Hercules, created by Lysippus himself, was destroyed. The bronze horses that adorned the hippodrome were stolen and carried off to Venice, where they still can be seen today inside St. Mark's Basilica. The famous work of the Tetrarchs that we all know so well was carried off most likely from the Philadelphion and now also stands in Venice. Even the head of Emperor Justinian himself can be seen these days in Venice and not in Istanbul. But most bronze statues were not stolen, they were mostly melted down to make coins for the Crusaders. Many of the city's sanctuaries were assaulted or outright destroyed. Even the tombs of all the emperors in the Church of the Holy Apostles were looted. The altars of most churches were smashed and torn into pieces for their gold and marble. It is incredible how many works of art and other precious relics from the Roman imperial times were destroyed or looted. Many monuments that had not been consumed by the fire of 1203 were now quite certainly damaged beyond repair. In the aftermath of this one of the greatest tragedies of humanity, on par with the most brutal sacks of Rome in the 5th and 6th century, Constantinople would enter a long decline. This was what actually broke the neck of Constantinople, to speak metaphorically, and which would also diminish the Eastern Roman Empire to such a lowly state that it would never recover. A Latin Empire was then established, and for over 50 years did Latin emperors reign the city, during which many people moved away and the city's population started to dwindle dramatically. When the city was reconquered by the Eastern Romans in 1261, already then the city was in very bad shape. The population then might have dropped to 100,000, a far cry from the 500,000 of before the sack. And the Latin emperors were not really very motivated to upkeep and repair the old works of art and the old monuments of the Romans. Thus, it was that the hippodrome would now start to fall into ruin, that arena which had served for 1,000 years as a place of ceremony, a place of grand festivals and meetings, and a place of chariot races in the early centuries. It was this sack of 1204 which would ring the final death knell for the city, from which it indeed would never recover, not the empire and not the city itself, and most ironically, inflicted by Christians upon Christians. Thus, because the Eastern Roman Empire had been so weakened by this event, was it that 250 years later the Ottomans had such an easy game in conquering this once mighty city. The irony of history. During the course of these 250 years, the city would transform from an impressive city of 500,000 people to a collection of small villages interspersed by fields of ruins and cow pasture with only some 50,000 people left in the city. So when people say that it was in 1453 that Constantinople fell, think again. Because in reality the old Constantinople fell in 1204 and never recovered. What happened in 1453 will be the topic for another video, but actually the Ottomans conquered an impoverished shadow of its former self, a city that had been dying since the quarter of a millennium. And all these glorified stories about that epic battle of 1453 turns out are quite exaggerated, because it was in 1204 that the even greater tragedy happened, from which the old Roman Empire would never recover. And please like this video and subscribe, dear viewers, so that you won't miss any videos on the fascinating topic of the late Roman Empire. And I would be extremely happy if you would support my work on Patreon or via a YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. This channel would not work without our amazing Patreon and YouTube members, and I want to thank each and everyone who is supporting this channel in any form. Gratias tibiago, amici. And if you want to learn more about how exactly Constantinople had transformed from a pagan to a Christian city, you can watch this video here in the upper right corner. But if you are more interested in learning how Constantinople looked in the Byzantine Dark Ages, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.